Hello and welcome to today's video where we're going to continue our COLREGs in-depth series and look at Rule 5, Lookout. As always, we're going to look at the rule itself and then apply that in a couple of different situations. So Rule 5, Lookout. Rule 5 is actually one of the most important rules that there is. Every vessel needs to be applying this all of the time. This is what's going to enable you to apply the rest of the collision regulations. You need to be able to keep a proper lookout so then you know what's going on. Every vessel shall at all times maintain a proper lookout by sight and hearing, as well as by all available means appropriate in the prevailing circumstances and conditions, so as to make a full appraisal of the situation and of the risk of collision. So a couple of the main points. You need to be keeping a lookout at all times. There's no getting away from that. If you're not keeping a lookout at all times, you're in contravention of the rules. That lookout has to be mainly by sight and hearing. Those two are referenced specifically in the rule. Again, if you're not doing either of those things, you're in contravention of the rules. As well as by all available means, means you can lump in every other means that you've got at your disposal on that bridge, but sight and hearing need to take priority. And what you're looking to get is a full appraisal of the situation, not just the risk of collision. So in all the other rules where we're looking at action in collision situations, we've needed to work out if risk of collision exists, and if so, take action. But keeping a lookout, you need the full appraisal of the situation, as well as the risk of collision. So looking at Rule 5 on the bridge of a ship, we're going to label up forward ahead and aft behind, and we're going to place an officer of the watch perched on one of the chairs in the centre in front of a radar screen. This is probably a pretty typical image on the bridge of most ships. Now what does that officer do? My guess is they'll look out to port for a little bit, then they'll look out to starboard for a little bit, and then they'll return to looking at the radar screen in the centre. They're looking ahead, they can see where the ship's going, but they're not keeping a proper lookout. Let's see why. That officer's based on this container ship. He's travelling along quite happily, he's looking ahead of him, can't see anything, so he's in clear water, he's clear to keep going, looking a bit to port, a bit to starboard. But, by doing so, he's missed the great big passenger ship that's coming up on his port quarter. The only time he'd be aware of this is if it shows up on the radar screen, or when it pulls a beam of him. He's not kept a proper lookout, he's not got a full appraisal of the situation, he doesn't know everything that's going on around his vessel. How could he have got round this though? As well as looking out from side to side, all he would have to do is just get up from his chair every now and then and just have a walk around the bridge. He's looking out astern of him. When he's looking astern, he sees the other vessel that's coming up on his port quarter. He needs to be keeping that lookout across the full 360 degrees of the horizon. He needs to know everything that's going on ahead of him as well as behind him. Just looking ahead isn't enough. Looking at the radar screen isn't enough. You need to be looking out in all directions. When he's looking out in all directions, of course, he'll be travelling along quite happily, and then at the first possible moment, he'll see that other ship coming. He'll see that he's going to need to take action. In this case, it will be the action of a stand-on vessel, so he would just need to maintain his course and speed unless the other vessel didn't take action. But what else could keeping a proper lookout involve? Let's have a look down at the container ship itself. If we place the officer of the watch on the bridge, and we assume he's keeping a proper lookout, he's looking to port, to starboard, behind him, he's listening out, he's using his radar and all other electronic means. What else could he do? For example, in restricted visibility, if that visibility's come down and he can no longer see far in front of him, he's going to need to post additional lookouts up forward. This is all part of that vessel maintaining a proper lookout. Where, for example, Rule 19 says that you need to adapt to restricted vis when applying the other rules, this would be a good example, posting extra lookouts at the forward part of the ship so that you can try and get that full appraisal of the situation and of the risk of collision. Hello and welcome to today's video where we're looking at Rule 6, Safe Speed. As always, we're going to look at the rule itself, and then I'm going to use some diagrams to help explain it in a little more detail. So Rule 6, Safe Speed. This rule can actually just be summarised in this first paragraph alone. Every vessel shall, at all times, proceed at a safe speed so that she can take proper and effective action to avoid collision and be stopped within a distance appropriate to the prevailing circumstances and conditions. Okay, so if you just apply this first paragraph, you are complying with Rule 6. The rest of the rule simply goes on to give some examples of things you need to consider when deciding your safe speed. In determining a safe speed, the following factors shall be among those taken into account. So these aren't all the factors you need to take into account, but these are among the ones that you must. First part applies to all vessels. The state of visibility. Of course, in clear visibility, you can see quite a long way away. In this case, 6 miles. But when that visibility reduces, you can no longer see the vessel that is that far away. They need to get a lot closer before you'd be able to see them. In this case, 3 miles. Now, seeing a vessel at 6 miles is very different to seeing them at 3 miles. You still need to be able to take time to assess the risk of collision and to take action to avoid collision. So the visibility is going to have a major effect on what you determine to be safe speed for your vessel. The traffic density, including concentrations of fishing vessels or any other vessels. The speed that you consider safe is going to be very different if you're in this open sea situation compared to if there's other vessels around you. And equally, if there's even more vessels around you, again that's going to affect your judgment of what a safe speed should be. The manoeuvrability of the vessel, with special reference to stopping distance and turning ability in the prevailing conditions. Fairly obviously, if you're on a supertanker that's going to take 3 miles to stop, you're going to want to be travelling slower than if you're on a high-speed ferry that can pull up within its own length. These are all going to affect your decision on what a safe speed is. At night, the presence of background light, such as from shore lights or from backscatter of her own lights. This kind of comes back to point 1, the state of visibility, because all these are going to do is affect at what range you can see another vessel, be able to take action to avoid collision. Of course, your speed is going to have a direct impact on the amount of time you've got to take action. The state of the wind, sea and current, and the proximity of navigational hazards. If you're in a heavy sea, you're going to want to be slower just to be able to keep your vessel safe and avoid damage. If you're travelling along and you're experiencing strong wind or strong current, obviously you're going to be setting away from that wind or current. It's going to be pushing you sideways. The speed is going to have a direct impact on how much you set. In this second example, where I've halved the speed, the vessel is still going to set at the same rate sideways, but because she's making a lot less headway, she's actually going to appear to be travelling at a far greater angle sideways than she would have been if she had been travelling faster. This is probably quite a good example of how a slower speed is not necessarily always the safest speed. Coming back, if she was wanting to counter that, and she's going to put an angle of helm on so that she can steam in a straight line over the ground, again, her speed is going to have an impact of what sort of angle she's got to make. You can see that the swept path is very large in this instance. She's in a narrow channel, her speed is maybe not safe. And the draft in relation to the available depth of water, and here we're talking about squat and interaction. Speed has a direct impact on these. I think it's a squared impact, so reduce your speed, you reduce the effect of squat and interaction. The next part goes on to talk about vessels with operational radars. Characteristics, efficiency and limitations of the radar equipment. So we're talking about the physical properties here. How high is it mounted? If you've got an X-band and S-band, if you've got a long pulse, short pulse, what's the resolution like? Will it detect targets? You know this by using the equipment. Obviously, if there's limitations in that equipment, that's got to affect your judgment of safe speed. Any constraints imposed by the radar range scale in use. Maybe the white vessel is on a small range because they're navigating close to shore. They wouldn't detect the other vessel. If they're on a larger range, of course they would pick up that other vessel. This is going to have an effect on the speed you deem to be safe. The effect on radar detection of sea state, weather, and other sources of interference. So these are things that are going to clutter up the screen and obscure other vessels and make it harder to detect other people. Possibility that small vessels, ice, and other floating objects may not be detected by radar at an adequate range. This isn't something you can control. This is more just reminding you, yes, you've got a radar, but not everything is going to show up on it. Speed still needs to allow you to take action if you see something else that you haven't picked up by radar. The number, location and movement of vessels detected by radar. This goes back to the traffic that we discussed in the first paragraph. If you've got more vessels, of course you're going to want a slower speed so you can take action. And the more exact assessment of the visibility that may be possible when radar is used to determine the range of vessels or other objects in the vicinity. This again goes back to the first paragraph where we're using the visibility to determine a safe speed. You can use your radar to get an exact reading of that, and that is going to affect your judgment. And that brings us to the end of Rule 6. We've seen some of the factors that you need to take into account when determining safe speed. And remember, if you're the officer or the master, not only are you using these factors, you've got to use every factor available to you to determine what speed is safe for you to be travelling at a particular time. Hello and welcome back to COLREGs in Depth. Today we're going to be taking a look at Rule 7, Risk of Collision. As always, we're going to look at the rule itself, and then we're going to apply that rule in a couple of different situations. So Rule 7, Risk of Collision. First paragraph. Every vessel shall use all available means appropriate to the prevailing circumstances and conditions to determine if risk of collision exists. If there's any doubt, such risk shall be deemed to exist. Now you'll notice this echoes Rule 5, where we were using all available means to keep a proper lookout. Now we have to use all available means to determine if risk of collision exists. Paragraph B. Proper use shall be made of radar equipment, if fitted and operational, including long-range scanning to obtain early warning of risk of collision, and radar plotting or equivalent systematic observation of detected objects. Now radar plotting itself I covered in a different video, which I'll link up in the card at the top. But what this paragraph of the rule is saying is we need to use systematic observation. So radar plotting, we're talking about taking a series of plots on the radar. Or visual plotting, we're looking at taking a series of compass bearings. We need to be systematic about it. We can't just look and take one snapshot in time. We need to do it systematically and observe it over a period of time to determine if risk of collision exists. Assumptions shall not be made on the basis of scanty information, especially scanty radar information. This is going back, we need to take systematic observations. So we need to take a series of bearings, a series of radar observations. Scanty information is basically incomplete information. We need the whole picture to determine if risk of collision exists. We cannot make assumptions on scanty information. Then finally, in determining if risk of collision exists, the following considerations shall be among those taken into account. Now these are just among the considerations, these are not the only ones, but these are among the ones that you need to take into account. Such risk shall be deemed to exist if the compass bearing of an approaching vessel does not appreciably change. What we mean by this is if we put ourselves on the white vessel and we're going to observe the blue vessel, we need to take a bearing of the other vessel. Now we take the bearing as the difference between our heading line and the bearing of the vessel, and we need to continue to monitor that as we approach each other. Clearly in this case, that bearing is not changing. The vessel stays going down that same constant bearing, which means risk of collision exists. But that's not the full picture. Paragraph 2 says that such risk may sometimes exist even when an appreciable bearing change is evident, particularly when approaching a very large vessel or a tow, or when approaching a vessel at close range. What does this look like? Well, if we take the same situation, but let's say we're approaching a significantly larger vessel. Now to take a bearing of it, we need to pick a part of that vessel that we're taking a bearing of. It's too large to just take a bearing of the whole vessel. So in this case, our bearing is going to be of the bow. Now watch what happens as we approach each other. If we're looking down that same bearing line, we're no longer looking at the bow. The bearing of the bow has changed significantly. But that does not mean risk of collision does not exist. If we continue to play the animation, we can see that even though the bearing change was evident, risk of collision still exists. We're approaching a very large vessel. What about a tow? If we go back to the same diagram, but we'll put a tug in front of the vessel.
Now we're going to take a bearing of that tug and see what happens when we continue to approach each other. Looking down that same bearing line, we're no longer looking at the tug. The bearing of the tug has changed. But if we continue on, we can see there's still risk of collision. Even though that bearing change is evident, because we're approaching a tow which has a very long length, risk of collision still exists. And that brings us to the end of Rule 7. We've seen how we determine if risk of collision exists, we've seen the importance of systematic observation, we've seen that you cannot make assumptions, and we've seen that if the compass bearing of an approaching vessel doesn't change, risk of collision exists. But we've also seen that in some cases, even if the bearing is changing, risk of collision may still exist. Hello and welcome to today's video where we're looking at Rule 8, Action to Avoid Collision. As always, we're going to look at the text of the rule and then apply that in a couple of different situations. So Rule 8, Action to Avoid Collision. We'll just head straight for the first paragraph. Any action taken to avoid collision shall be taken in accordance with the rules of this part, and shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, be positive, made in ample time, and with due regard to the observance of good seamanship. This paragraph is very much the common sense paragraph. Obviously, in accordance with the rules of this part means the action needs to comply with the rules, we know that, it needs to be positive, in ample time, and you've still got to observe good seamanship. It's all stuff we already know. The second paragraph. Any alteration of course and or speed to avoid collision shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, be large enough to be readily apparent to another vessel observing visually or by radar. A succession of small alterations of course and or speed should be avoided. So for example, in this crossing situation, obviously the blue vessel is going to have to keep out of the way of the green vessel. If they just make a small alteration, yes, they've made a bit of an alteration, but the green vessel hasn't been able to see what they're doing. And of course, as the blue one gets closer, they've got to make another alteration, and this is what we mean by a series of alterations. It's not obvious to the green vessel what the blue vessel is doing. And of course, the blue vessel has got to continue making more and more alterations until they get clear. Instead of that, what they should do is make one single bold alteration. Now, when the green vessel is looking over, they can immediately see that the blue one has taken action. They can see a complete change in aspect. They'll actually be seeing the vessel head on now, instead of seeing the broad starboard aspect. If there is sufficient sea room, alteration of course alone may be the most effective action to avoid a close quarters situation, provided that it is made in good time, it is substantial, and it does not result in another close quarters situation. The easiest way to explain this is to look at a speed alteration. In this case, the blue vessel is going to halve her speed. There, she's instantly halved her speed of approach to try and avoid collision. And look at how close she gets to that green vessel. That alteration of speed was not an effective alteration. And bear in mind, in this diagram, that alteration happened instantaneously. In a real life example, of course, you'd have to allow time to run that speed off. From this, we can see alteration of course alone may be the most effective action. It's immediately obvious, it's very easy to undertake, and you don't need to allow all that time to let speed run off your vessel. Action taken to avoid collision with another vessel shall be such as to result in passing at a safe distance. The effectiveness of the action shall be carefully checked until the other vessel is finally passed and clear. So again, this is kind of a common sense paragraph. You need to take action that's going to keep you a safe distance. The rule doesn't tell you what that safe distance is, but that will depend on your vessel. So whatever action you take, make sure you have a safe distance. And then you need to continue checking until the other vessel is finally passed and clear. So if you are ever asked at what point you can alter back to your original heading, the answer will always be once I'm finally passed and clear, straight out of Rule 8. If necessary to avoid collision or allow more time to assess the situation, a vessel shall slacken her speed or take all way off by stopping or reversing her means of propulsion. Again, this one kind of makes sense. If you need more time, just stop your vessel, stop running ahead, give yourself more time to assess the situation or avoid the collision. And now we're on to Part F. Part F deals with not impeding the passage and safe passage. So it's actually quite a complicated rule, and part F forms 3 parts. First off, a vessel which by any of these rules is required not to impede the passage or safe passage of another vessel shall, when required by the circumstances of the case, take early action to allow sufficient sea room for the safe passage of another vessel. So a couple of things in here. Obviously the first thing that stands out is we're talking about not impeding the passage or safe passage. So within the rules they'll talk about impeding passage or impeding safe passage, but the action taken is the same regardless of whether it is passage or safe passage. And what we're looking to do is allow sufficient sea room for the safe passage of the other vessel. We're not talking about avoiding collisions, we're talking about allowing sufficient sea room for them. Let's take this example of a crossing situation. Of course, under the crossing rule, normally the container ship is going to have to alter around to starboard to keep out of the way of the green bulk carrier. But what happens if, for example, we say that the container ship is constrained by a draft? Now, the green vessel is required not to impede her passage. So what they've got to do is they've got to take early action to allow sufficient sea room. So before the container vessel is going to want to take action under the crossing situation rule, the green vessel has got to take action to allow sufficient sea room. So in this case she's going to make a bold alteration to starboard and parallel the course of the container ship. She's taken early action, allowing sufficient sea room. Then paragraph 2 of part F goes on to say, a vessel required not to impede the passage or safe passage of another vessel is not relieved of this obligation if approaching the other vessel so as to involve risk of collision, and shall, when taking action, have full regard to the action which may be required by the rules of this part. And what this basically means is that you cannot say, oh, risk of collision exists, I'm going to apply the crossing situation rule and stand on. So we'll go back to our example here. We know the container vessel is actually the give-way vessel. The green vessel is just meant to be allowing her sufficient sea room. But the action the green vessel takes needs to bear in mind what the container vessel may do. So, the green vessel alters round to port, she's got to remember that the container vessel may have taken action, assuming she is the give-way vessel, which she actually is. In this case, constrained by a draft, she can't deviate from her course really, so all she's going to do is slow right down, and that's put the two on a collision course again. What the green vessel needs to do is bear in mind the action that she may take, which is why the typical thing to do would be to make a bold alteration round to starboard and parallel the course of the container vessel. Then the third paragraph just goes on to confirm that again. A vessel, the passage of which is not to be impeded, remains fully obliged to comply with the rules of this part when the two vessels are approaching one another so as to involve risk of collision. So in our example, although the green vessel is meant to not impede the passage, the container ship remains fully obliged to comply with the rules of this part when they're approaching one another involving collision, which means it's still a crossing situation, the container vessel is still the give-way vessel, even though the green one should allow her sufficient sea room. And that brings us to the end of Rule 8.